Good morning and happy Sabbath. It's been a wonderful week. Cool. It's like winter is here, though it's only fall.
We're very glad.
Indeed, the coolness is wonderful. If you'd like to have an interactive Sabbath school, there's a Zoom Sabbath school. Please check the weekly e-newsletter that the church sends out for those, the meeting ID and the code numbers and so forth. But if you're with us, Lesson 7, Worship in Education.
Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for today. Thank you for your blessings. Thank you especially for your Spirit who always seeks to prompt us to worship, to praise, to learn. And right now we ask that you send your Spirit to guide this discussion and our minds so that we can think on you and learn of you and praise you. For we pray in your name. Amen.
Memory verse from Chronicles, Old Testament.
1 Chronicles 16. And we'll be going back to Chronicles a couple times, but looking at 1 Chronicles 16:29 is the verse. Give to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. O worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Wow, it sounds like a hymn, doesn't it?
Well, that last part is from a hymn, of course.
The hymns from the Bible. But yes, indeed, it's lovely. All right, so looking at what is worship? You could ask 20 people, what is worship? And you would get
20 different answers, of course.
exactly.
Of course. Worship is a unique human experience, but it's an experience that is part of humanity. I find it very fascinating that the lesson brings to the fact that worship is part of our created entity. And I would certainly confirm that, despite what sin has done to that worship over the millennia, there's part of us that must worship. And unfortunately, it's worship something. It's
Yeah.
not always God.
Well, and when we look at what prompts us to worship, that's what we should be thinking about. What is prompting us? Is it God's love? And if it is not God's love, if it is a determination to make it a perfect worship, if it's a determination of this is a right worship and only this is a right worship, then we begin to look at some differences. This week we had a virtual week of prayer. And as I thought about it, it was hard for me in many ways because when you do a corporate worship with teens, you know, it's going to be make a joyful noise. And I always tell our alumni when they come back, you know, it may not sound the same, it may not look the same, but we're doing the same thing. And one of the songs, I think, was sung by one of our youth from Glendale on Thursday. And the girls did a beautiful duet of I'm Coming Back to the Heart of Worship. And it's all about you. That song just, does me in every time I think about it because it really truly, you know, we go out worship and then often I'm sorry I didn't make it about you. And that's what we really need to do.
Well, and I think the fact too that we have that worship part of us, it's very easy and it has become probably more fundamental in most people's lives than not, that the worship is something other than God. We have many, many gods, lowercase g, in our lives. Even the Christian might have that because of, oh, this is what I must do to be saved. This is what I have to do. And then the doing itself can become part of worship.
Even becoming so involved in a theological idea that all I focus on is that one theological idea, and I'm gonna tell everybody, and I'm gonna make them all learn it and believe it. You know, God, when He wants us to worship, more than anything, wants it to be prompted from His Spirit in our hearts, and that's really what Sunday's lesson is about. You know, we're all gonna worship something, and you know, in our world, how many things do we worship?
Some people worship time. Many Many people worship money or what money can bring. The safety, family, jobs. The list can go on, and it's
Yeah, TV, music, sports, you name it. It can be so many different things that we get caught up in our everyday lives. And I was thinking this week, as I was going through this lesson, we often look at idols and we talk about the idols other people have. Um, you know, and we forget that we have a little idol in our own life. Sometimes it might be bigger, might be smaller.
well, and the fact too that it changes from time to time, even within Adventism. I remember one of our former pastors once said that where he was presently serving, that there were ideas that were so big that it was dividing some churches, and it was over diet. Wow. So maybe the quote from David Foster Wallace is so apropos. If you worship the wrong thing, it'll eat you alive.
Yeah. Well, and all of those things that we make idols are not going to give us more life. They will not in the end be our salvation. And that, I think, maybe is what we need to look at in this first section. The story goes to Daniel 3, and when we go to Daniel 3, I thought I'd marked it here, evidently I didn't. When we look at Daniel 3, it's the look at the
It's the story of
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue, and this is what you're going to worship. And of course, the three Hebrew companions of Daniel, Babylonian names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're like, no, we're not going to do that. And the amazing thing to me is, while they were spared, Nebuchadnezzar still didn't get it about worship, because after he brought the boys out, he said, well, they were young men by this point in time, he said, I make a new declaration. All will worship the true God. He's commanding worship? Still trying to command worship, not of a golden image, but the true God. We can't command worship. Worship is something that comes from us as a response.
Nebuchadnezzar, in his attempt to bring everybody together, to me, it's an interesting view of worship. I've served on worship committees at, I don't know, many churches. And when I've worshiped with those people at those churches, always our question is our worship only about ceremony and tradition? Or is our worship about something greater? And Nebuchadnezzar was all about showing this amazing statue that he had created. And it was really, truly about his accomplishments. And I got to thinking, are some of our programs that we do, are they our way of setting up an image? So people will go, oh, Eagle Rock is a really great place to go to church. Look at their amazing program. Or is it something that draws them? Is there something that calls them to worship? And I think, I was thinking about the songs that we sang. I don't know if Eagle Rock did this. When I was a child, we had the Lord is in his holy temple, and
No,
that little beginning thing.
I don't think we ever did. I think we have done songs like that in the beginning part of the service, but I don't think we ever sang "The Lord's in His Holy Temple." I don't recall that, but it's possible. There are several of those in the hymnal.
Well, I
calls
learned a
to
lot
worship.
of them in high school because, we did church services at the plethora of churches in Portland. Learning to say, the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silent. Let all the earth keep silent before him. And that always was kind of a solemn, calming call, and then of course, the hear our prayer, O Lord, and the things that call us to worship. But as I've been thinking about this, the pandemic has made it a little bit difficult to worship because I feel like, I always tell my students when I'm talking to a screen, and it's hard to get beyond the screen to feel the communion. And I think sometimes we feel like that with God. And sometimes we feel like I can't begin to get beyond that screen where I really feel the worship. But when we look at the Holy Spirit in our lives, that is what will prompt us to worship. And it won't be about where it's going or what it looks like.
Well, should worship be a feeling anyway? Our emotions are so fickle and untrustworthy. Should it be a feeling? I'm not so sure it should be all pomp and ceremony, or no pomp but all ceremony, but I think it's a response. True worship is a response. A feeling? I don't know. I want to touch, before we move on though, on the very last part of Sunday's lesson on page 57. The whole question of worship. It's the very last few lines before the read Revelation 14, 6 through 12. The whole question of worship is, what is it? How do we do it? Why is it important? And whom do we worship? That is the crux. Later on in the lesson, I've put it in a little different terms, but it kind of says the same things. And Revelation 14, 6 through 12 is, come out of her, worship the Lord, for He is God, more or less, I think is the call. The loud proclamation,
Proclaim to those who dwell on the earth,
yes.
to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people.
Fear God, give Him glory, worship His judgments are at hand, and so forth. And of course, it's because it's the ones who worship are those who keep the commandments of God. And of course, the first 3 commandments deal with worshiping God.
Yeah.
Actually, the first 4, because the 4th one, of course, remember the Sabbath day. But it is just that, what is worship? How do we do it? Why is it important? And whom do we worship?
So looking at Monday's lesson, declare them to their children. This is a tough section. I do this every day with my students, but I think this lesson, Thom and I were talking about it, and this lesson is not just for teachers who educate other children. This is how we educate our own children and how we educate those who come into church later in life. And all of us have a part of that. All of us are part of the reminding of those things. And so looking at Psalm 78, Psalm 78 is actually a really, I'm glad I read it this week. It is a beautiful, beautiful psalm, and it's long.
I was going to say, and lengthy too. I didn't read it. So that's why I looked to see what she was pointing to.
It is a beautiful, beautiful psalm.
But it's not as long as Psalm 119, which is 175 verses.
It's only 72.
This is only 72, so it's a short one. But
No.
what part does it points to just 9 verses.
1 through 17.
Oh, I was looking at the second portion.
Yeah.
All right, so it goes through the first 16 verses.
Okay, so I want to read because I think this is a beautiful, beautiful psalm. And the first part especially is very meaningful, I think. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. Now, in tradition, I'm going to stop for just a second. In tradition, for these early cultures, I'm going to call them, you didn't just say like someone's name like David. You would say, from the lineage of, and you would add in a man after God's own heart. You would add in restorer of Israel. You would add in other things. So when they say, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching, incline your ears to the words of my mouth," it's the same thing, but it's bringing emphasis to it. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders which he has wrought. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should not set their hope in God, nor forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn, rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful. And then the next section goes on and talks about the sins of Israel. And then it goes into lusting after the flesh in the wilderness and how God provided them in the wilderness coming out of Egypt. And then, and how God keeps bringing them back. And it even goes through the plagues and, with the hail and the flies and all the different things. And then going on, talking again about his faithfulness and Israel's unfaithfulness, and how Israel forgot, and how he kept coming back to them, and how he was merciful and forgiving. It's an astounding psalm. But when I read the first part of this, I was so touched with just a beautiful way of laying out what God wants us to do. And I thought, wow, when we get back together, this is like a perfect script for our first time back together. It's beautiful.
Well, and the key, too, I think, at the beginning portion of it, and even later, the writing of the psalm is remember. Remember. Why is it so important to remember what's happened in the past with God? Or with anything, for that matter?
I think it's part of the repetition. I think repetition, how many times and how many ways does God say, "I love you"? "You're my people. I want to be your God." Over and over and over in the Bible. That is God's mantra.
And he points, the author of this psalm points back to the course of the olden times, the dark times, not dark as in mystical, magical, but in the past. Your memories fade. You've heard that expression.
And that's why you need to
And
repeat.
so remember, repeat. Yes, remember, repeat.
Yeah.
How God has led us in the past points to how he'll lead us in the future, because he says, "What am I? I am. I don't change."
Yeah.
So what I did back 6,000 years ago, I'll do today. I'll do tomorrow.
It may not look exactly the same, but it's going to be the same. And as I was going through that, one of the question, how do we worship? And, we tell the old stories. I love it when I can go back through a Bible story, because often I'm like, wow, I didn't think of it quite that way. And, when we talk about God's law, sometimes I think that we put it with the 10 Commandments, or we put it with, here are the laws of how to live and how to do all the different things, Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all those things. But he says, I want you to tell the wonders that I've done. So that's from the Bible all the way to now. And the wonders and the deeds. Are we collecting right now deeds of what God's done for us while we've been apart, so that when we get back together, we share those deeds that he has done? And then it says, train the next generation train the next generation.
Tell them so they won't be like you.
Yeah, and train them so that they will love the old stories, so that they won't go, oh, not that again. To teach them to love worship, to teach them to love praising God. How do we train them? Do we train them as a list of rules, and here's the way worship has to be, and this is how we do it, and only this way? There's a lot that goes with
That's
that.
kind of a throwback from the 50s and 60s. I think we've matured as a church and a people beyond that. But there is some continuity then, but to that though as well.
Yeah.
So, yes, again, why do we worship? How do we worship? Whom do we worship?
Yeah.
You know, Tuesday's lesson starts with the conversation Jesus had with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, and she quickly takes their conversation when he says, you know, draw me some water, and she's like, well, you know, yeah, I'm thirsty, and she goes, I'll give you living water, and then she quickly says, well, you know, since you're a teacher, where's the right place to worship? Some people say it's Jerusalem, some say it's here in Samaria.
Yeah. And do you know better? Do you know more than our father Jacob? It was kind of like a prove yourself kind of moment for Jesus. And Jesus didn't even take a bite of it. He didn't say, are you kidding me? His proof was, if you drink from the water that I'm giving you, you'll never be thirsty again. If you just give me a drink of this water, that's not the kind of thirst I'm talking about. And I think that concept of never being thirsty again takes us to the well, that is Jesus Christ.
And then, of course, the conversation went on to Jesus saying, doesn't make any difference really where you worship, because true worship is in spirit and in truth. And the lesson points out that means, of course, knowing who God is from a personal standpoint. Mm-hmm. You know, what is it? What is it then if the person is not to that point in their relationship where they truly know who God is? Can they have true worship?
Well, and that's where I probably show my 70s growing up. To me, you know, when we look at our maturity, I was thinking as I was reading through this lesson, when we used to pray with the girls at Sabbath school or at our family vespers that we would have once a month with the church community, the girls would kneel down, but then all of a sudden they'd be prostrate with their hands folded in their heads, but they're on the ground, on their knees, but still on the ground praying. And it reminded me of the pictures that I saw of people kneeling down to idols. But for the girls, no, I'm serious, because it was like that prostrate right down. But that was, for them, that was a way to not see anything or be tempted to open their eyes.
My favorite, though, was when Alyssa went to kindergarten and at one point in time was praying, and dear Lord, may Alyssa come to know the Lord as I have.
Yeah.
A 5-year-old.
And so when
Just pure innocence of that worship.
So when we look at worship, our worship is going to change. You know, what comforts me in worship, what makes my heart swell with love for God, are some of the old hymns. But those are connected to me through my worship experience. And what other people might experience, where they're all about, give me a sermon that is Bible-based and has the meat. That's what I want every single time.
You know, Joan Graham once said that if congregants come out and say, Pastor, I liked your sermon, the pastor should be offended. The pastor's sermons shouldn't be likable. They should move one to do something. And that is uncomfortable, so you're not going to like it.
Well, you might like it, but it might also kick you in the behind.
Well, who likes to be kicked in the behind?
Well,
So, yes,
that's
anyway, but again, having, what are the objective truths? God, what does God reveal to us in worship too? Is a very important factor in knowing who God is. Go ahead, read it. Go ahead, dear.
It's amazing. We study our lessons separately, but there's so many times that I'm looking over and I'm thinking, wow, we underlined the exact same thing. God is the Spirit. Those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. That was our memory verse. But a little bit later, it says, our worship should purify our heart and renew our mind and give us a new capacity for knowing and loving God. And what a beautiful thought that is, to think that, is this something that's going to renew my mind? Maybe that would be a guidance for a worship committee to talk about. Is this going to help people renew their spirit, not just in feeling good, but renewing their spirit and their mind, and drawing it to the Spirit of God, and what we can have there. So knowing God and loving God is part of worship, but also then looking at how we can change with worship and draw closer to God.
Picking up on the earlier lesson too, from the memory verse, the beauty of holiness, Wednesday's lesson. There's something about formal worship that is beautiful. At one school where I was principal several years back, of course there were many non-Adventists enrolled in the school, as is true of all of our schools. There are non-Adventists, of course. And this one particular mother was talking about a service they were having at their church, and she invited me to come and go to it. I don't remember what it was. It was some big festival day for their church. And part of her family is Seventh-day Adventist, but part is not. And I don't know how we got on the topic, but she said, but how can you take away the tradition? The tradition! And I thought, is that what worship is about? The tradition? The beauty of holiness, coming apart. To be holy means to be set aside, to come away from, to be set aside, to be specifically isolated for a reason. And I think that central key theme in the beauty of holiness is the plan of redemption.
Yeah.
And how worship needs to draw us to reflect upon what that is for us.
Yeah, and in First Chronicles, it's a long section again, 16:1 through 36. I won't read the whole thing, but David in his psalm says that, oh, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known his deeds among the people, sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all his wonderful works, glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his presence continually. Remember the wonderful works that he has done, the wonders he has wrought, the judgments he has uttered. O offspring of Abraham, his servant, son of Jacob, his chosen ones. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He is mindful of his covenant forever of the world and is commanded for 1,000 generations. Wow. 1,000 generations, we're part of that. The covenant which is made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, he confirmed as a statute to Jacob and an everlasting covenant to Israel, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. When they were few in number, of little account, the sojourners in it, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, touch not mine anointed ones, and do my prophet no harm. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Tell of his salvation day to day. Declare its glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all peoples. For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and he is to be held in awe above all other gods. For all gods of the people are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Honor and majesty are before him. Strength and joy are in his place. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the people. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in holy array. Tremble before him, all the earth. Yea, the world stands firm, never to be moved. Let the heavens be glad and the earth rejoice, and let them say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the fields exult and everything in it. And then the trees of the wood sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever.
Well, I heard lots of songs, words in there, but also
Yeah.
a thought struck me, there's a whole lot of evangelism in there.
Yeah.
A whole lot of evangelism. So then maybe worship takes on a different tack too of sharing
Oh, maybe
and
that's why we have
evangelizing.
education in worship.
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe.
So I want to go to the concept of a covenant. Sometimes we get the idea that the covenant is only about, Israel.
Well, no. The old covenant was, of course, but the new covenant, which really was the old covenant, but still the new covenant, but was the old
Yeah.
covenant.
Okay, get out of that
In any
cycle.
point, it was, you are my people. And of course, after Christ's death and resurrection, it was no longer just to the Israelites, but the covenant was with all those who claim Christ to be their Savior.
And those who keep the commandments of God and worship
The
His name.
testimony of Jesus.
Yes.
Have the testimony of Jesus.
And that takes us,
Well, the part you read, which is a memory verse, I just want to
Yeah.
touch on this one before we move on to Thursday's portion of the lesson. 1 Chronicles 16:29, I said, learn, know, and do.
yeah. And are we encouraging people to do that? I think so often, one of the gifts my mother gave me as a child, I'm going to say this carefully. One of the
My dear,
gifts,
she's not going to see this.
I know that's true.
Actually, that's not true. She's going to say she watches this on occasion.
One of the things my mother was wickedly strict about was she always said, think of the words. Now that
For the
often went
songs.
for music, but it also was, we were not allowed to not listen to the sermon. We couldn't take a book and read. We could write down keywords and keep how many times they said that. That was acceptable. But in general, we were expected to sit and learn and listen. It has changed how I worship because people say, when we've had different pastors come and go, people say, well, doesn't it matter who the pastor is? And I said, well, it's always nice if there's a good preacher, but that's not why I worship. And that's not the reason I go to church. The reason I go is because God will speak to me in the sermon. God will, but it's my response to Him and His Spirit. And I know that, Thom and I have both experienced where people will say, oh, thank you for your message about, and then they tell you something, and I think,
That's not what I said.
I'm pretty sure I didn't say that. But when God speaks and people come longing to hear His voice, it will be the right message. And that's maybe what we need to teach our children, how to talk about God, how to tell others about God, so that they will always know that they have a testimony. They have a way to share God. When they're young, they can share it through Bible stories. But as they grow older, they will experience more things that allow them to share it in a personal way that is meaningful.
The authors of Thursday's lesson talk about the idolatry in education, and of course, that in just a very quick synopsis is taking, I don't want to say secular, but taking man's view of whatever it might be. And the lesson points out that it's a very naturalistic view of reality, how things happen to us in nature, how it occurs naturally,
In history.
and apply that to forming worship or worship ideas that can be very contrary to Scripture. You know, we have read several times, remember, teach it to your children when you are waking up, when you are lying down, when you're walking by the roadside. Teach it to your children. Remember, remember, remember. That remembrance of what God has done for us creates within us an attitude of gratitude. I don't mean to rhyme there and try to be poetically funny, but that thankfulness draws us to worship. You know, the last 6 months since COVID has hit has totally changed how we do things in America and in the world. And well, as I drive to work every morning, I listen to through the internet as I travel with my phone, a station out of Oakland, California called Family Radio, and they have little sniglets throughout. It's a Christian radio station, played Christian music and Christian music, more traditional than contemporary. But there was a saying. I almost want to write to the station or call them and say, I want the script for this particular part of this radio broadcast, because it talked about, it was a father's response to what had happened in a tornado that they had experienced the year previously. And basically what happens is, of their two children, one of them gets killed. And I thought, okay, so I have the inconvenience of having to teach online. Boy, do I have it easy. What's really important? What's really important? And that's what comes down to worship. What is really important? What does the Bible teach about worship, and what is important? Why is it important? What is the focus? What's the idea that we need to be sure that we have steadfast, that we're not swayed then by the humanistic view of worship?
Well, and I think in this year, just from March till now, we're in the 11th month. We had maybe 2.5 months at the beginning, and then if we can get a vaccine, we might get some into 2021. But when we look at it and we look at all the things that have happened, I know that there is a great push to be more accepting like Jesus, to be more loving like Jesus. And we begin to bring in earthly arguments, whether it's about how people live their lives, whether it's about their political views, whether it's about, topics that are so controversial like abortion or there's just 1,000 different issues out there. Gun control. I mean, there's just so many. And we begin to try to put morals into a worldly issue so that we can bring it in and make it part of how we view and make our beliefs okay. When God says, let that go. That's not even a part of what I'm concerned about. Jesus, as he went through, he never let all the issues, the people being stuck with Rome ruling over them, and then having, Pharisees that told them how to live, and then having priests that were, accepting bribes, for lack of a better word, with selling, extortion. I mean, just all the things. he didn't he didn't approve of them, but he didn't make that the big issue. And I think that's what Thursday's lesson is looking at. We want the ideas to be made okay because we want to care about it. And if we want to care about a worldly thing, we are letting it become an idol. And what God says is, look at this plan that I have. Look at this plan of salvation. When you look at this plan and how I'm working it to the end, are you really going to be worried about those other topics?
It's kind of like, if God can do everything and anything, can he make a rock so big you can't lift it? What does it have to do with your salvation, whether you can or can't? What's it come down to, really? The plan of salvation, what the Creator God did for his wayward creatures.
What he did originally and then his plan. We get so caught up in trying to justify what we eat, how we worship, how we live, and what we say is okay or not okay. And God says, really, you're worried about that? That's where you're going to spend your time, and you're going to make that your idol that will keep you from spending time getting to know me. And that I struggle with. And I was looking at Friday's lesson, and it was talking about the fact that there's a quote from Ellen White, and it's from Spiritual Gifts, the second volume.
We're looking at page 62 of the regular quarterly now.
Yeah. And it says partway through, some lean on an old experience they had long ago. And this is talking about professors of religion. Now, when you read this, you may read professor meaning a teacher, like a college teacher. But I read it as people who profess religion. Well, then all of a sudden, it's about all of us and not those nasty professors at colleges. Some lean on an old experience they had years ago, but when brought down to this heart-searching time when all should have a daily experience, they have nothing to relate. And then it goes on and talks a little bit more about it, and says, you will then draw divine strength, and this is if you turn to God. You will draw divine strength from Jesus. You will grow up in him and be able with holy triumph to say, blessed be the God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. It's a tough one, isn't it? Yeah. Are we relying on our old stories? I'm not saying they're bad because that's part of our worship. But are we allowing God to grow in us to the point where we have new stories every single day?
That's where I was going to draw into, if you weren't going to pop up on that, was real soon, is the old stories are great, but are we having new stories to relate and tell as well? Well, this happened here, and this led to this, and this led to this, and now, as opposed to, back 20 years ago, and
Yeah.
absolutely.
I was talking to my students about our Thanksgiving journals. We do every year. I make my freshmen do them, and
She makes them do them.
Yeah, you're gonna be thankful. That's what I always tell them. And I said, by the end of the month, you'll be going, because I've made you write every day. But I said, every class after you always ask me, are you gonna have them write the Thanksgiving journals? Because it's a thing, and they recognize that when we have that attitude of thanks and blessings from God. So the one for today was about writing a psalm. Oh my, you'd think I'd ask them to...
Chop off their right arm?
Well, no, to create a research paper that's 25 pages long. And I had them pattern it after Psalms 100. That's an easy one. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Yeah. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. It's not a hard one. And I told them, I said, You can make your psalm about anything, and you're going to make it 5 verses. How hard is it to write, praise the Lord? This isn't, you know, come worship Him with thanksgiving. It's not a hard concept. And yet they really struggled with, how do I have the words to talk to God? And I told them, I said, what you offer is worship to Him. What you offer is praise to Him. And that's all you need to think about. What are you thankful to God about? Oh, well, they had things to thank Him for. I said, then just write it down and put a number so it's a verse.
So the image we have of God is what creates true worship within us?
Yes, and if we don't have an image of God, if we don't have a relationship where we say, how much I love you, you are so important in my life. That's where our praises should spring from.
And perhaps that's where the spirit and truth that we worship God in, true worship is of spirit and of truth, where that comes from. Knowing who and what God is, the image that we have of Him. And hopefully it's a growing image. It's not the same continually as we learn and study and find more things about Him. There's discussion questions that I think are in the regular quarterly too at the end of Friday's presentation on page 62. Numbers 2 and 3 really made me think a bit, and I would put it to you to spend some time thinking or rethinking about it perhaps. Dwell more on the idea of worshiping God in spirit and in truth. Is it possible to do one without the other, or does true worship demand both? If so, why? And then this last one, yes, our hearts need to be right in order to truly worship God. But what does that mean? I think we look at the rules, so to speak, so often. And rules are important, but as I think we mature in not just our spiritual growth, but our lives in general too, we get past the rules and think about the whys behind the rules, perhaps. Israel had lots of rules coming out of Egypt because they had been slaves for nearly 400 years. They didn't know anything else but to work to a rule. Do this because, here's the rule.
Exactly.
So it's what they were used to. God took them where they were and said, this is what I want for you, though. I don't want you to be slaves forever. In fact, what did He say to His disciples? You aren't my servants or slaves. You are my friends. I want you to be my friends. So, the Lord, the last part of question 3, do we have to wait until we're totally connected to the God, with the Lord, with your life in perfect order before we can worship? Well, I should say, I hope not, because no human could ever worship then, because our lives aren't going to be in perfect order ever.
Well, that would be
On
lovely.
the other hand, the authors go on to finish, how can we worship, true worship, and help get our hearts right in the right place with God?
Well, we're very subjective about our worship. We've tried to make it acceptable in His sight, right? George Bernard Shaw, there's a quote in the teachers section, a quote from George Bernard Shaw, and it said, God may have created us in His image, but we've decided to return the favor. That's what Lucifer did. Lucifer was like, I want to worship you, but I want to also be worshipped.
Yes, I will put my throne above the highest.
There you go.
I will.
There you go. And looking at that concept, do we do that with our worship? Do we make it what we think is acceptable to God? And are we looking at God's image? And what is His image? His creative power, His everlasting love, the fact that He is the I am. Those are things that all enter into what make us believe that worship is what we make it. But worship is truly a response to His love, to His redeeming power. That's what He wants us to do. Respond to that. The other stuff is lovely. The music, you may or may not like it. That has too much, modern technology in it. We should get back to only this. You know, there's so many different aspects that enter that. But what is it that we need to do? And that will be very subjective to us in our experience.
The authors of our lesson point out the first time the word translated worship in the Bible is used is in the story of Abraham and Isaac, when Abraham is told to take Isaac and sacrifice him. And the authors point out that it's used when Abraham says, okay, servants, you stay here. Isaac and I will take the wood and the fire and go up to the mountain and worship. And what Abraham got in that experience was the sacrifice of Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
The God Father, Abraham, not that he was the God Father, but giving his son in sacrifice and willing to do so to the point where he had the knife and was plunging it downward when the angel grasped his hand to stop him from killing Isaac. The plan of redemption has got to be the key of worship. It's a response. When we realize what Jesus has done for us, what the Trinity designed for us, before they even began to create, I think before they began to create any sentient being, not just this little puny earth, a speck way out in the Milky Way galaxy, but any sentient being, I think they came up with, what happens if these thinking creatures say, don't think so, I'm going to go my way. They had that plan to bring us back. How else can we worship except,
Respond.
yes, in that response?
Respond to his love.
Well, let's close with prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you. Thank you for bringing us back to the heart of worship, as the song says. And it's all about you. May we focus on you this Sabbath day. May we recreate the oneness you want to bring us back together, to atone at one moment with you, that we truly can be your children, your son, your daughter, your brother, your sister. As we look forward to your soon second coming, I pray that we will draw closer to you, that we may have a new story to tell as we learn and grow in our relationship with you. These things I ask in your precious name. Amen.
Amen. Have a great Sabbath, and I wish you all God's blessings as we get closer in this Thanksgiving season. See you next week.
Bye-bye now.